The newest manned weapon in SAC's arsenal to maintain the peace is the supersonic delta-wing B-58 Hustler jet bomber.
Conditions favoring maximum efficiency and comfort.
This hideous cloud is a revolution in military strategy, an entirely new philosophy of international relations. Standing in awe before it, three men realized that the secret of this incredible new weapon could not be held for long.
There was a time when the United States Air Force was dead certain of one thing. If the world was going to end in a nuclear inferno, they were going to get their bombs there first, and they were going to do it at Mach 2. Welcome to the height of the Cold War, where bombers weren't just weapons, they were status symbols, giant gleaming monuments to American engineering, and a not so subtle way of telling the Soviets, catch us if you can. And in that race for speed and altitude, one aircraft promised to blow the competition, and possibly itself, out of the water. This is the story of the Convair B-58 Hustler, the first operational supersonic bomber in history. A machine so fast, so ambitious, it was the fastest thing with nukes ever put in the sky. A technological marvel cursed by bad timing and the rapidly changing realities of the Cold War. Today, we're going to dive into the rise and fall of the Hustler. To understand where the B-58 Hustler came from, you've got to put yourself in the paranoid, radiation-soaked mindset of the late 40s. World War II had just ended with a pair of mushroom clouds over Japan. The United States had a monopoly in nuclear weapons for about 5 minutes. By 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully tested their own atomic bomb, and suddenly, America's long-range bombers weren't just offensive weapons, they were the last line of defense. Strategic Air Command, or SAC for short, was tasked with keeping the Soviets in check. Their philosophy was simple: build a fleet of bombers so fast and so high-flying that nothing could intercept them, and if war ever broke out, the US would be able to strike first and strike hard. At the time, SAC's bomber of choice was the Boeing B-47 Stratojet, a jet-powered, swept-wing bomber that looked futuristic but still topped out at around 600 miles per hour. Not bad, but not fast enough to stay ahead of Soviet jet interceptors, and soon, surface-to-air missiles. Recognizing that their existing bombers were basically dead men flying in the face of improving Soviet defenses, the Air Force initiated the Generalized Bomber Study in 1949. It wasn't a formal requirement yet, but a wide-ranging study into what a next-generation supersonic bomber might look like in the jet age. It asked the big question: could a bomber exceed the speed of sound? Could it deliver a nuclear payload deep into enemy territory before the Soviets could react? And if so, what radical new designs would it take to get there? A number of companies submitted ideas: Boeing, Douglas, Martin, but it was Convair, with its growing experience in delta-wing aircraft and supersonic experimentation, that took the most audacious shot. By the early 1950s, the Air Force established Weapon System 102, the formal designation for what would become the B-58 program, and Convair's daring design was selected for development. At a time when Mach 1 was barely achievable in military aircraft, Convair promised a bomber capable of Mach 2 speeds, with over a 1,500-mile range and flying higher than any interceptor or missile could reach. It was an outrageous goal, but this was the Cold War, and America wasn't exactly known for playing it safe. Convair wasn't just building a bomber, they were trying to build a future, and as history would soon show, chasing the future at Mach 2 has a habit of catching up with you. When Convair set out to design America's first supersonic bomber, they didn't just break the mold, they incinerated it. At the heart of the Hustler was its radical delta-wing configuration. Delta wings had been a pet obsession for Convair, seen on experimental fighters like the XF-92 and the F-102 Delta Dagger. The idea was simple. A delta wing gave you excellent high-speed stability, a large internal fuel volume, and decent high-altitude lift, perfect for a Mach 2 bomber. But there was a catch, or several. While Delta Wings performed beautifully at high speed and altitude, they were notoriously unforgiving at lower speeds. Takeoff and landing were a handful. Handling in turbulence was dicey, and it made the B-58 a demanding aircraft for even the most seasoned pilots. Powering this futuristic beast was 4 General Electric J79 GE5 turbojet engines, the same powerhouse used in the F-104 Starfighter and F-4 Phantom. Mounted in pods under the wings, they give the Hustler its blistering top speed of over Mach 2, but at a cost. They guzzled fuel like there was no tomorrow, which, in a Cold War context, wasn't exactly reassuring. Then there was the B-58's truly unique payload arrangement. Unlike traditional bombers with internal bays, the Hustler carried its nuclear weapons and extra fuel in an external pod slung beneath the fuselage. This streamlined pod could carry a nuclear bomb and additional fuel, or swap configurations for reconnaissance gear. It was a clever way to maintain the B-58's razor-thin aerodynamic profile, but it made rearming and maintenance awkward, reduced overall versatility, and complicated operations. Worse, if you dropped the pod, your range went with it. The crew layout was equally unusual. 3 men seated in a tandem arrangement under separate canopies. The pilot up front, followed by a navigator/bombardier, and finally the defensive systems operator in the rear. Early versions of the B-58 were equipped with standard upward firing ejection seats, not exactly ideal when you're screaming through the stratosphere at Mach 2. If you punched out at those speeds, your chances of surviving the wind blast and temperature extremes were basically zero. Recognizing this little flaw, later models of the Hustler were retrofitted with enclosed, clamshell-style ejection capsules for each crewman. These capsules sealed the occupant inside a protection pod, stabilizing their descent and increasing the odds of surviving a supersonic bailout. It was a futuristic solution for a futuristic bomber, though not without its own problems. Now, a bomber isn't much without its weapons, and the Hustler systems were some of the most advanced of the time. As mentioned before, the B-58 carried a single thermonuclear weapon housed inside a streamlined MB-1C pod slung beneath the fuselage, which carried additional fuel. But chronic leakage issues led to its replacement with the improved two-component pod, or TCP. This new design separated the bomb into an upper section and fuel into a lower, jettisonable tank, allowing the pilot to clean up the aircraft's profile or ditch excess fuel in emergencies. Between 1961 and 63, the fleet was retrofitted with tandem stub pylons under each wing root, letting each Hustler haul up to 4 additional B-43 or B-61 thermonuclear bombs alongside the centerline pod. Defensively, the B-58 carried a single 20mm T-171E3 rotary cannon used in a radar-controlled tail barbette. This wasn't some old-school gunner's window. Instead, the Emerson MD7 automated radar fire control system handled targeting. The defensive systems officer in the rear seat simply locked onto a target blip on a scope, and the MD7 calculated range, closure rate, heading differential, and aiming corrections, all automatically. And here's where physics gets weird. At Mach 2, the forward muzzle velocity of the T-171 cannon was actually lower than the Hustler's own airspeed, so when a round left the barrel, it would be moving backwards relative to the ground. The B-58's arsenal also included optional gear like the LA-331 photo reconnaissance pod and experimental weapon systems like the High Virgo air-launched ballistic missile, which saw 4 test flights. Concepts for electronic warfare pods and early cruise missiles were proposed but never adopted. The first B-58 Hustler prototype, officially designated YBRB-58 and serial number 550660, was completed in late August of 1956 and rolled out of Convair's Fort Worth plant on September 4th. An extraordinary looking aircraft that, even without its operational equipment fitted, was already a symbol of aviation ambition. Most of the space where weapon systems would eventually go was occupied by banks of test instruments and recording devices. Initial preparations proceeded quickly. The first engine run-ups took place on October 1st, followed by cautious taxi tests beginning October 29th. Then, on November 11th, 1956, 550660 made its maiden flight, lifting off from the runway at Carswell Air Force Base. At the controls was test pilot B.A. Erickson, accompanied by John D. McEachern, system specialist, and Charles P. Harrison, flight test engineer. The aircraft reached a maximum speed of Mach 0.9 on this conservative first flight. The pace of testing accelerated. Supersonic flight was achieved for the first time on December 30th, when 550660 nudged through the sound barrier at Mach 1.17. Over the next several months, a battery of Category 1 tests were conducted, ultimately logging some 3,000 flight hours. The prototype program steadily expanded, with other aircraft entering service and progressively stretching the Hustler's envelope. On February 16, 1957, 550661 flew for the first time, carrying a test MB-1 freefall pod. By June 29th, the original prototype 550660 reached Mach 2.03 at 43,350 feet, carrying a dry pod. Successful pod drops followed. The first on June 5th, 1957, when 550662 released an MB-1 pod at Mach 0.9 and 40,000 feet over Holloman Air Force Base. Subsequent drops were carried out at progressively higher speeds and altitudes, culminating on December 20th with a clean drop at Mach 2 from over 60,000 feet. By the end of 1957, the B-58 had attained a maximum speed of Mach 2.11 at altitudes above 50,000 feet and could sustain Mach 1.15 for over 90 minutes. Extraordinary performance for the time. Yet, behind the record-setting numbers lurk serious and stubborn problems. The General Electric J79GE-1 engines installed on the early YB-58s suffered from fuel system malfunctions that caused fuel to slosh dangerously, a phenomenon called fuel stacking, during rapid acceleration and deceleration, leading to stability issues. Afterburner performance was erratic at supersonic speeds, sometimes inducing yaw oscillations. Excessive vibrations produce acoustic and sonic fatigue, leading to cracks along fuselage rivet lines and the delta wing stress skin panels. Brake and landing gear systems pose their own hazards. With landing speeds approaching 230 miles per hour, the heat generated during landings and high-speed taxiing frequently resulted in tower failures and braking malfunctions, particularly at high gross weights. In parallel, structural durability was a major concern. An engineless B-58 frame built between 550663 and 550664, but never assigned a serial number, was shipped to Wright-Patterson's Air Force Base for long-term fatigue testing. It was delivered in dramatic fashion on March 12, 1957, slung beneath a modified B-36F Peacemaker and a special shackle system installed to carry the Hustler's fuselage with only 22 inches of ground clearance. By September 1957, improved J79GE-5 engines began arriving at Convair, though they too faced an arduous test program. Refueling trials commenced on June 11, 1958, where the Hustler proved surprisingly capable with the new KC-135 Stratotanker. On June 11, 1959, confident in the Hustler's potential, if not yet its reliability, the U.S. Air Force announced plans to procure 290 B-58s, including 30 pre-production and test aircraft, enough to equip a planned 5-wing strategic force. It was expected the first operational wing would stand up by November 1960. Though it had overcome many of its early limitations, the B-58 emerged from testing as a paradox, a machine of dazzling performance and unforgiving demand, one whose operational viability would hinge on the skill of its crew and the resilience of its maintenance team. As the dawn of 1959 broke over the B-58 program, Convair's engineers and Air Force leadership alike could feel both anticipation and apprehension building. The first combat-ready production Hustler, serial number 592428, was completed in the spring of that year, signaling a major milestone for the embattled program. Yet, even as the aircraft stood gleaming on the ramp, trouble loomed. In July, General Thomas Power, commander of Strategic Air Command, was dealt a sobering message from the Pentagon. The nation's defense budget could not stretch to meet every one of SAC's ambitions. Though a fleet of nearly 300 B-58s had once been envisioned, fiscal reality forced a drastic reduction. By the end of 1959, that number had been pared down to just 148 aircraft, with cost estimates for the 118 scheduled through fiscal year 1961 soaring to an eye-watering $3 billion, making each Hustler literally more valuable than its weight in gold. Compounding these financial setbacks were critical safety concerns. A string of high-profile accidents through 1959 and 1960 rattled confidence in the program. Fires during refueling, catastrophic mid-air disintegrations, and losses during supersonic flight trials cast a pall over the program and stoked concerns within SAC's ranks. One particularly haunting incident occurred on November 7, 1959, when B-58 550664 disintegrated in midair near Lawton, Oklahoma, killing Convair test pilot Raymond Fitzgerald and flight engineer Donald Seathuff. Nevertheless, SAC remained committed to fielding a combat-ready B-58 force, believing its Mach 2 performance would impose a disproportionate burden on Soviet air defenses, forcing costly countermeasures in a classic Cold War strategy. Despite budget constraints and operational hurdles, plans continued for 3 wings of B-58s, initially to be based at Carswell and Bunker Hill, with a third location still under consideration. Delays and uneven production created a logistical headache. Early aircraft varied in systems, equipment, and modifications. To address this, the Air Force launched 2 major upgrade programs: Senior Flash Up for operational units and Junior Flash Up for low-time test aircraft. These initiatives standardized the fleet, adding improved anti-icing, countermeasures, and structural reinforcements. Amid these trials, the Hustler earned its place in history through a string of record-breaking flights. On October 15th, B-58 58-10-15 sustained Mach 2 during a flight from Seattle to Carswell in just over 70 minutes. In 1961, the Quick Step 1 project saw 59-24-42 set 3 speed with payload records in a single mission, while 2 days later, 59-24-41 averaged 1,284 miles per hour over a 1,000-kilometer closed course, earning the Thompson Trophy. A New York to Paris record in May 1961, a transcontinental round trip from Los Angeles to New York in 1962, and a zoom climb to 85,360 feet that same year. The final marquee achievement came in October 1963, when a Hustler flew supersonically from Tokyo to London, spending 5 continuous hours above the speed of sound, a potent demonstration of SAC's global reach. Through adversity and accomplishment, the B-58 program forged ahead, embodying both the promise and peril of cutting-edge aerospace technology. By the early 1960s, after years of development setbacks and technical growing pains, the B-58 Hustler was poised to enter operational service. The 43rd Bomb Wing at Carswell Air Force Base became the first unit to receive and operate the new bomber, achieving combat-ready status in August 1962. The 305th Bomb Wing at Bunker Hill Air Force Base followed suit, with plans for a third wing eventually shelved as shifting defense priorities and budget pressures emerged. Though the Hustler brought unprecedented speed and altitude capabilities, it also introduced significant operational challenges. Maintenance demands were high, costs steep, and the accident rate continued to worry SAC leadership. In fairness, the Hustler operated in a flight regime no bomber had ever attempted. Sustained Mach 2 flight, complex avionics, and demanding workloads on the crew meant that running the B-58 at full capacity required highly skilled crews and dedicated support teams. Pilots transitioning from B-36s, B-47s, and B-52s faced a steep learning curve. In addition to its deterrent role, the B-58 remained a symbol of American aerospace dominance, with its early record-setting flights capturing headlines and reinforcing SAC's global posture. However, as Soviet air defenses improved and missile-based deterrence gained prominence, the Hustler's high-altitude strategy began to show limitations. Mission profiles shifted to low-level penetration tactics, but the Delta Wing, optimized for high-speed, high-altitude flight, struggled in turbulent, dense air at low altitudes. Its sophisticated systems also proved less reliable in those demanding conditions. By the mid-1960s, It was clear the Hustler's operational limitations and soaring maintenance costs would limit its long-term role. While it remained a potent deterrent symbol, practicality as a frontline weapon system was increasingly in question. Attrition and wear gradually reduced the fleet, and advances in missile technology and the ever-versatile B-52 rendered the B-58 redundant. In January 1970, the Air Force officially retired the B-58 from SAC service. Of the 116 built, only a handful survive today as museum displays, silent monuments to one of the Cold War's boldest aerospace experiments. Though its operational service was short-lived, the B-58 Hustler left an undeniable mark on aviation history. It proved the feasibility of sustained Mach 2 bombing missions, pioneered advanced inertial navigation systems, and introduced crew escape capsules, innovations that would inform later programs like the XB-70 Valkyrie and the SR-71 Blackbird. The Hustler's record-setting flights and global demonstrations pressured adversaries to develop costly new air defenses. It redefined bomber performance, even as its own limitations foreshadowed a shift in strategic thinking. In 1970, the B-58 was replaced by the F-111 Aardvark, a swing-wing, terrain-following strike aircraft better suited to modern nuclear delivery tactics. The F-111's variable geometry wings, advanced avionics, and low-level penetration profile made it a practical and survivable successor. Today, preserved B-58s stand as monuments to a remarkable chapter in Cold War air power. The aircraft's legacy lies not only in its records and missions, but in the way it pushed boundaries and challenged aerospace engineers and strategists alike. The B-58 Hustler remains a symbol of an era when speed was king and America's nuclear deterrent raced along the edge of Mach 2 flight. The story of the B-58 Hustler has fascinated me for so long, enough that I decided to make a video about it, obviously. The fact that we went from this to this in a little over 10 years is absolutely crazy. And in an age when the limits of flight were shattered like every year, the Hustler stood apart, and it still stands apart as one of the craziest things humans have ever built, right up there with the SR-71 Blackbird. And actually, after the Hustler was retired, a lot of the pilots that they used for the B-58 Hustler were then retrained to fly the SR-71 Blackbird, because they were some of the most experienced pilots when it came to supersonic flight for like long durations. Although I would have loved to see these things flying around in service today, it makes sense why they were retired. You know, you had the Soviets in 1957 deploying one of the most widely deployed air defense systems in history, the SA-2, which was a high-altitude air defense system. Kind of made the Hustler, well, not kind of, it made the Hustler obsolete in that sense. So, and then it was forced to fly at low altitude, which it was not designed for. Its replacement, the F-111, was much better at that job. Pair this with improvements to ICBM technology, and yeah, you don't really have a need for the B-58 Hustler. Apart from just looking pretty in the runways, which, to be honest, I think is well worth it, in my opinion. I think we should have a B-58 Hustler in every runway in the United States, but I don't think there's enough of them left for that. But yeah, anyways, thank you for watching. A like and subscribe would be greatly appreciated. And if you would like to see more videos like this on this channel, which is a little different from what I normally do transit-oriented videos, a couple history videos as well. But if you want to see more videos like this one, just let me know in the comments. I have a couple topics running through my head that I would like to make videos on. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.